You know, in Canada, we like to think of our country as just one big whole thing. And in school, we were taught that our country looks like this. It's just one big landmass sitting above the United States with 3 oceans on either side. There's about 36 million people here, and we're the second largest country in the world. It has 2 founding nations, the English and the French. That's what we're taught in high school. But you know, if you ask Indigenous people what Canada looks like, they think of a map that looks more like this. This map shows all the various Indigenous nations that live in Canada from coast to coast. There's at least 50. They have all sorts of different languages. And these nations were here before the French, the English, or the Spanish ever came to North America. And so from an Indigenous perspective, Canada is not one country with 2 founding nations, but rather a country that is made up of at least 50 nations. 52 if you count the English and the French. And that's sort of hard for us to think about because we're so used to thinking about Canada as just being one nation state. You know, and that's what we do when we have the Olympics. Canada sends athletes. But from an Indigenous perspective, that's not the case. And you know, the interesting thing is, before Canada became a country, even the British Crown agreed with the Indigenous people. Back in 1763, King George III issued something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It declares that all land in this country that we now call Canada belongs to Indigenous people unless the Crown buys it in bits and pieces. And if you wanted to have a settlement like Peterborough or Kingston or Toronto, the Crown would have to buy that land from the Indigenous people, leaving all the rest of the country to the Indigenous people. And that's how the Crown saw it in 1763, and that lasted. And as a result, we live in Toronto, and Toronto was bought in the late 18th century, and it's called the Toronto Purchase because we bought this land from the Indigenous people. That all of the land around Toronto continued to be possessed by the Indigenous nations. Now, that idea that Canada is mostly Indigenous with pockets of settler areas, of course, is not the way we see it now. In the 19th century, in Canada, increasingly, settlers came to believe that all of the land should belong to them and that Indigenous people should be pushed off the land and put into small pockets, which became known as reserves. And in 1867, that idea was codified in the British North America Act and has been in place ever since. And this is one of the reasons why Indigenous people and settlers see Canada very differently. Because Indigenous people remembered that they made deals with the British Crown, which was in charge of the colony of Canada when Canada became a country in 1867. So they say all of their agreements with the British Crown should still stay. If that's the case, then Canada is one country with many nations. The settlers, of course, have said, nope, it's just one country and we own it. That, however, has been something which legal scholars have been wrestling with. And increasingly, even the Canadian state is coming to agree with the Indigenous position. In 2017, the Federal Department of Justice issued 10 principles for guiding their negotiations with Indigenous people. And one of them was that it explicitly recognizes that there are multiple nations of Indigenous people in Canada, and each one of them has the right to self-determination and self-government within the land which they possess. So the pendulum is swinging back towards the original notion of Canada being composed of multiple nations. And that's something worth thinking about as we come away from Canada Day, wondering just how much we can celebrate Canada Day. Well, perhaps the better question would be, what is Canada anyway?